Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have the biggest roundtable I think we've ever had on the podcast, and I'm super excited for it. We're talking intuitive eating, which is obviously something that has become particularly popular in the last few years, although it's been around for quite a while, and I think there's been some kind of misconceptions, there's kind of differences in opinion on the subject matter, and I think these guys here, of which Mike Israetel, Gabrielle Fundaro, Miguel Blacutt, and Jackson Peos all have very good insights into intuitive eating and somewhat differing opinions. So I thought, well, I will give credit to Gabby, who thought it would be great to have a roundtable with everyone to talk this out between kind of, very like-minded, but maybe not so like-minded on everything. So without further ado, I will let Gabby kind of introduce the definition of intuitive eating, and then we'll work our way from there.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. So I realize that intuitive eating is sort of being promoted now as the new anti-diet diet. That is sort of a misnomer. It's probably a great way of garnering more attention. But intuitive eating is really about more than just food, and it is certainly not a dieting tool. It is a self-care framework. So it allows us to recognize that humans will certainly have some biological needs around food, but perhaps there are other drivers of food intake, such as social cues and emotional cues. So really the purpose of intuitive eating is to facilitate a normal eating pattern. So we're improving relationships with food, we're breaking potentially harmful dieting cycles, and we're becoming more attuned with our biological hunger and satiety signals, and also recognizing the possibility that perhaps when we have a desire to eat something, that need might be better met through other means that are not food. It is a HAES-aligned approach. So HAES stands for health at every size. That does not mean that there's a belief that everyone is healthy at every size, but that individuals can pursue health-seeking behaviors regardless of size. And that it's very important for patient and client outcomes that we take a strong stance against weight stigma. So they are promoting weight inclusivity and really a focus on health enhancement and respectful care and well-being. And instead of just focusing on the outcomes, the what do we want to have happen, we're focusing on the process. Why do we want to do something? And then how are we going to facilitate those changes? So it is actually okay for weight loss to occur as a potential side effect of pursuing these health-seeking behaviors. They're not anti-weight loss. They are just not looking at weight loss as a prescription for an individual. Instead, we're looking at the behaviors that we would want to encourage that would lead to improved health outcomes.
Cool. So I guess I'll move over to kind of Mike, if Mike's ready to go, kind of what his thoughts are on that kind of, the definition of intuitive eating and kind of the practical application of that, and where maybe, where kind of you and Gabby had your discussion, where that might go.
Sure. Gabby sent out a document that was quite inclusive as far as information is concerned. And I had a few things to say about that. That's maybe a little bit outside the scope because that gets a little bit technical. But I think that some of the terms here have either been poorly defined by their creators, mixed with other terms, or as Gabby says, has been a little bit misused by other folks, potentially those not in the know. Intuitive eating is itself, to begin with, probably a really not so great term, because intuition means something that intuitive eating doesn't exactly mean. It turns out the intuitive eating concept actually means something much better than what it literally means, which is a good thing. There's another concept in there called mindful eating, which is also misappropriated, also inherently titled wrong. But it has potentially even more of a benefit, or at least as much of a benefit as intuitive eating, so we should probably talk about that. And so outside of those sort of more technical critiques or questions we could definitely talk about later, I do have a couple of immediate concerns. One is the impetus to trust biological hunger signaling in intuitive eating. So there's an understanding that, some of your signaling for eating is potentially almost purely psychological. So you get stressed and you want a bag of Cheetos. Maybe if you realize that you were just stressed and dealt with that, or you really love the taste of food, so you're continuing to sort of mindlessly consume food, even though you've been full for quite a while. You're just using it for pleasure. It becomes difficult to regulate food intake like that. And if you simply sort of noted when you were hungry, you were full and ate when you were hungry, that could be a potential solution. There are some questions as to how that would actually be implemented. Quite a few folks probably have a hard time telling apart whether or not they're hungry or whether or not they want to enjoy food. It becomes a little bit difficult to define how to enjoy food. If you're supposed to stop eating when you're hungry and not when you stop enjoying food, those two things can actually be quite different from each other. My biggest question about this, though, is that in many overfat people, there's actually a pretty big, I don't want to say broken, but the biological hunger signaling mechanisms are pretty far off. And those people, if they eat until they're actually full, will continue to remain overfat and at a high degree of adiposity for quite some time, potentially forever. So trusting your instincts, so to speak, could be a bit perilous if your instincts are fundamentally misaligned with your health. Right? Some people really actually do need to stop eating before they're full, and trusting hunger cues might be what got them overfat in the first place. Now, not everyone. So intuitive eating can help folks to whom it's non-hunger signaling that's making them eat, but there's certainly a fraction of people for whom this would not be the most amazing approach. So that's point number one, and we could address that first. I have another point that is probably even more controversial.
I think let's run with, I think Gabby looks like she has some thoughts itching to get out, so I'll let Gabby run on that one if that's okay, Mike.
Sure.
So this is actually, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because this is sort of one of the common misconceptions that we have to be good at intuitively eating before we can do intuitive eating. And actually the data shows that either scoring highly on intuitive eating questionnaires, so sort of intrinsically being an intuitive or instinctive eater, or weight neutral approaches that include intuitive eating principles, neither one of those actually correlates long-term with increased quote unquote junk food intake or BMI. And actually, you are correct that individuals with obesity, overweight, binge eating disorder, or bulimia nervosa, or actually individuals across the spectrum of disordered eating, and that includes individuals with anorexia nervosa, all have attenuated interoceptive awareness. So that's the ability to accurately recognize internal cues. That could be hunger, that could be fullness. And the way that they actually measure that is through recognizing heart rate. So this is actually kind of a really cool example of weight stigma, that we sort of attach that dysregulation only to individuals with overweight or obesity. But in fact, it could be that they have a difficult time recognizing it. It could also be not that they can't recognize it, but that they actually ignore it. And so that, as I said, could apply to individuals with anorexia nervosa or individuals with binge eating disorder. And interestingly, in individuals who adopt these intuitive eating principles, they actually have better attunement with their biological hunger signals. So that means that they actually are better at recognizing when they feel physiological hunger or biological hunger, and when they feel satiety signals. Now, the other thing that you mentioned was that they may not be eating for hunger reasons, and that is absolutely correct. And I think that's part of the reason why it's really important to talk about this, because, yes, for some individuals, it may be that they feel hunger because they're in an energy deficit. So that's one obvious reason why individuals might be driven to eat. But there are many other reasons. So if a person is feeling stressed or feeling sad, that you brought up that, perhaps intuitive eating might not, and I think that this is what I meant, that intuitive eating might not be ideal for them, because maybe intuitive eating could be interpreted as only eating when we desire to eat something. Now, there are no rules with intuitive eating or with mindful eating. The key there is determining why we want to eat. If the reason that we want to eat is not for biological hunger, that then provides us the opportunity to determine what else might meet our needs. And so if an individual has an eating disorder, like binge eating disorder, or they find that they're eating emotionally, it's actually a really effective intervention, because it's allowing them then to find better, more effective ways. I don't want to say necessarily better. Sometimes food does serve that purpose for that person in that moment. But the idea of mindfulness is that we are recognizing, we're remaining aware without judgment. So we don't have guilt, we don't have shame, and that's really important, that we're limiting those things in individuals who have disordered eating. But they're just recognizing, okay, perhaps in this moment I ate something because I was feeling emotional, and I decided in that moment I'm going to eat this food. And when they do that repeatedly, they might find that, well, that food didn't really make me feel any better emotionally or mentally. It seemed to make me feel a little bit worse physically. I might not want to continue that habit. So it is important that we're keeping in mind this mindfulness aspect of intuitive eating, and that intuitive eating is not synonymous with emotional eating. Intuitive eating is synonymous with meeting our needs accurately by pausing to be able to identify them.
Mike, do you have any immediate thoughts? I don't actually. First of all, Gabby, was just to clarify it for myself. So intuitive eating is, you said it's for people who kind of can do it, rather. So there's like a prerequisite to it, or
No, absolutely not. No, intuitive eating is not just a tool that we have to learn how to use. Intuitive eating is an entire non-linear process. It's a framework of self-care. One of the skill subsets would be mindful eating and the ability to recognize those hunger and satiety signals. But just like we might need to be able to practice recognition of reps in reserve, or pump, or differentiating between pain versus normal sort of discomfort during a workout, those things do take practice. But intuitive eating, you could look at some of the other principles of intuitive eating, like respecting, just respect for yourself or your body. So when we respect something, when we want to give it the proper care that it deserves for upkeep, that's something that won't necessarily be a skill subset. Of course, that would still take practice. If we have many years of internalized weight stigma and a lot of self-deprecating thoughts and negative thoughts, yeah, absolutely, that would be something that we could practice as well. Positive thinking and positive self-talk and unconditional positive regard. And actually self-encouragement is one of the key behaviors that seems to set apart individuals who maintain weight stability long-term versus those that don't.
And I think you've mentioned before, Gabby, that intuitive eating, it's not a diet as such. It's more of something that can work within a framework of like a diet. So like reps in reserve, you use that example, that can work in many different programs. Is that kind of the gist?
Yeah, I would say that, intuitive eating, because we kind of want to put everything into like, this is a tool, this is something that we can use and, potentially periodize. I would say that intuitive eating is an entire approach, it's an entire set of principles that we may use all or some of at a given period of time to break a cycle of chronic dieting, or to repair our relationship with food and with ourselves as well. Because quite often when individuals are cycling through chronic dieting, or when they have binge eating disorder, or when they are experiencing emotional eating, that they're having a difficult time with self-care that would reduce their need to use food in a palliative way.
Cool. Mike, do you want to have a response to that?
So then intuitive eating, on the umbrella of approaches it sort of maintains, is something that can be applied fundamentally in two ways. Gabby, let me know if you agree or disagree. One way is if you've been dieting for quite some time, potentially in hypocaloric states with very regimented psychological approach, and you're more or less burned out on it, and you're having a lot of trouble with your internal psychology and thus with results. And if you apply an intuitive eating approach full stop, which is what in the Renaissance woman diet book we called basically like full diet reset, which is where you more or less just stop caring and start listening to your body again and stop having goals for a while and then slowly reintroduce healthy eating principles. And then after several weeks or months or however long it takes, and you don't tell it how long it takes, it tells you, when you feel psychologically very well again, you slowly thread in principles of dieting again so that you can continue to lose fat or whatever, or gain muscle at the pace you wanted. So it's kind of use number one is essentially like a mega diet break for your psychology. And then use number two is when you do go back to a diet eventually, I'll say this, if you never go back into a diet eventually, it's totally cool too. So fine, but there's sort of not the target of our conversation, I suppose, today, because we're all diet experts. If you do go back to dieting, and once you do go back to dieting, you can use the overarching principles of sort of very much being in touch with your emotions about food, not eating compulsively or impulsively, so on and so forth, not having any needless morality or negativity judgments about your body or about food. You can take those with you into your next diet and have a more intuitive, though not intuitive eating formally, a more intuitive or a more mindful approach, which I like to use for your next diet, to make your next diet not as deleterious, not as cancerous to your psychology, so that you have to do fewer of those full diet resets in the future. Is that the case, Gabby? Or is it something missing?
I think that to recognize what both sides might say, that if we are looking at how we would want to apply intuitive eating as written in the book, not, some people say like eating intuitively, that it would be very different from taking a diet break or diet reset, because a diet break or diet reset is a break between diets with the acknowledgement that you do plan to do it again in the future, potentially. Whereas intuitive eating is a break from dieting. So from not between diets, a break away from dieting, from diet culture.
Can you clarify that, Gabby? Because you could say a vacation is a break from work, but it's also a break from work.
Right.
Both of those seem to be rather similar to me.
Between, meaning like we were dieting, we're taking a break now so that we can diet again and it won't be so awful. That's one potential approach. Not to say that either one of these is right or wrong, but I am venturing to guess that probably individuals who are Hays aligned would argue that we would not necessarily want to apply intuitive eating in that way, because it's still under the umbrella of a diet mentality of I'm taking a break right now so I can diet again. A break between diets versus a break away from the diet cycle, which would be.
And what's wrong with a diet mentality?
This is where a point of contention is, because people are sort of wondering, what does diet actually mean? A diet could be just any adoption of eating principles. So the way that a diet is defined when we're looking at the principles of intuitive eating is that it is a way of eating specifically applied to reduce body size. And if we assume that dieting is a part of diet culture, that diet culture pathologizes certain body sizes, it prioritizes at times body size over the health and well-being of the individual, and it assumes that there is some morality or some value associated with specific body sizes, and quite often can give rise to weight stigma, which is where we attach stereotypes to specific body sizes, not just larger body sizes, but smaller body sizes as well. And when that culture is internalized and manifests negatively, that can give rise to eating disorders or disordered eating.
That would be my biggest contention by far, is I think that the health at every size people are taking the baby with the bathwater in a massive way with dieting. Their dieting is an approach by, so anything you intake is dieting, and trying to have objective purpose or objective constructs about what goes in can be even more formal definition of dieting. I think a 3-year-old eats sort of whatever, or a 5-year-old, whenever you let kids like run around, eat whatever, you can't really say they're dieting because they just don't care. But anytime you try to formalize in some way and control your intake in some way, that is really the definition of a diet. And you can do that in a bunch of approaches that are very, very mindful, very, very intuitive, and very, very attuned to all of your different types of health, psychological and physical. And then you can also have a very pathological approach to it. As a matter of fact, you can have a pathological approach the rest of your life without ever trying to diet whatsoever. In fact, you can have a pathological approach or a relationship with your body weight in your physical appearance and with other people's eating without ever having a diet yourself. Probably the vast majority of people who have poor body image issues aren't even dieting. They're people who just eat whatever and just hate their bodies. If you've seen like shows like My 600-Pound Life or whatever, none of those folks are dieting. They all have unbelievably terrible approaches to the body image and their own sort of moral health, for lack of a better term. So I think that the health at every size movement, unfortunately, a large part of it has taken maybe the worst parts of dieting, and you could even say diet culture. Although I don't think culture is very relevant to this, because most of this happens inside of a person's head, and they would do it with or without culture. I think that what they do is they essentially say, okay, this is dieting at its worst. Thus, this is all of dieting. Thus, we're going to pull away from dieting altogether. And for example, body weight can be used in very negative ways, can be the locus of negative thoughts and negative relationships. Thus, we're just going to take body weight, its measurement, its tracking, and its value, and discard it because it has these negative effects. I would prefer that they instead focused on positive ways to deal with body weight. And in a large measure, I think that means not taking it so seriously, because there's for sure people, millions of people, that look at 155 pounds on the scale and they think bad person, and they look at 149 and they think I'm good again, which is totally terrible and totally wrong in every way. But to say, look, it doesn't matter if you weigh 149, 155, or 175, as long as you're A-okay up here, ignores the fact that probably the most predictive thing about health is your degree of adiposity in physical activity, and thus particularly adiposity. So the health at every size movement is actually, as it's written, health at every size is actually false statistically. So it already starts off with basically just dumping the baby out with the bathwater, and we're left sort of cleaning up the mess of being like, well, okay, not all dieting is bad, and if you approach it more intuitively with more mindfulness, it can actually be quite effective. I just feel like it's almost like the health at every size movement at its extremes is like a reaction like an animal or plant has to a negative stimulus. It's a drawback away from good things and bad things about diet culture. I would prefer that we dealt with it more head on and talked about exactly what about diet culture can be not so great, and what about diet culture can be totally fine, or how it can be approached well. Last real quick analogy, it's almost like you watch someone do race car driving and you see someone get killed in a car accident in race car driving, and you're like, race cars are the fucking devil. People die in those shits. No more racing. Or you could say, well, with all the safety equipment and proper race management, we actually have very few fatalities, and it's a really fun sport, and people like to do it. So as long as they're doing it right, not being reckless, maybe we can still have race cars. Every time I'm on Steve Hall's podcast, I always talk about race cars.
I wish I owned one. Then there'd actually be like some sort of reason behind it. But I've never even been in a race car. I have a stable
of race cars that they're actually raised from birth. The race cars and fed.
I have never even owned a car, so I can drive. Hi guys, Steve here. Just wanted to take a moment of your time to remind you of the Revive Stronger member site. Inside you'll find a thriving forum, a growing exercise library, presentations, research reviews, and courses. If you want to get involved, sign up via the description. Anyway, so I was thinking maybe Miguel, Mike said quite a few kind of various points there. I think you probably have maybe some thoughts on that.
Sure. I think that with the health at every size, it's also one of those things that gets misinterpreted probably from both angles. It's not something where we're saying that literally every single size, no matter what you do, is healthy. It is something where we're saying, okay, well, let's kind of treat weight a little bit as a non-modifiable risk factor. Just entertaining for that one. And let's get people who maybe have obesity or overweight to practice health-seeking behaviors. So things like exercising, eating more vegetables, eating fruits, sleeping more, stressing less, just overall improving things doing things that we know are going to overall improve their health and quality of life. And let's see what happens there. Let's see if we do an intervention that is weight neutral and compare that to other interventions where people are purposely losing weight, and kind of let's see what happens. There's actually a really cool meta-analysis that just came out in 2020 by Doug Moore, where they compared some like eight RCTs where people either took a weight loss or a weight neutral approach to dieting. The weight loss being, kind of like, okay, well, we're going to restrict your calories and keep track of all these cardiometabolic factors. Weight neutral, let's just promote you seeking healthy behaviors, eating better, appreciating your body, these types of things that are related to intuitive eating. And they actually found that both groups improved their lipids, blood pressure, glycemic variables, their diet quality, and physical activity levels by the same amount. There's actually, from all the measures that they took, there was no difference between groups. This can be further looked at by I think one of the first studies to look at this was by Bacon in 2010, where also they split like 78 people into groups that were either weight neutral or that had a specific weight loss intervention, and they measured similar things. So they measured all a whole panel of cardiometabolic risk factors and glycemic variables, and measured psychological measurements, and they found that both groups, despite the weight loss group actually losing a significant amount of weight over like 8 weeks, and the weight neutral group not losing any weight whatsoever, both groups improved cardiometabolic risk factors like LDL, HDL, triglycerides, HbA1c, by the same amount. The only difference between groups was that the weight loss intervention had a 41% dropout rate, while the weight neutral one dropped something like 8%. The weight loss group had more cognitive restraint and more bulimia symptomology, while the weight neutral didn't. So I think that partly what we're saying here is that no, we shouldn't promote the idea that you can literally be healthy at every size and you can just kind of sit on your couch and eat potato chips and not move at all. It's saying, okay, well, let's take your weight, and no matter what it is, let's promote similar things to what we would do if someone maybe had a smaller body size. Let's see those activities and see how that improves your health, but not focus on weight loss itself, because that doesn't really seem to have caused all that much benefit in people. People just really don't do well with it. They feel judged. They feel like they're a bad person. And I don't think that we can say, let's treat your weight as something that's just like objective and that you have no feelings about it, because people inherently do. It's something that we can't just change. We can't just say, just don't worry about it. It just doesn't work like that. People have tried. And all that has happened is that when people are told their weight, like at the doctors or something like that, they stop going to the doctors. Like it matters that much to people, where we're seeing a decline in people who are going to the doctors simply because that matters so much to them. So I don't think we can kind of take that approach where they're just saying like, don't worry about it.
Super interesting. And I think one of the things I was talking to Jackson off air about, at least, was the difference potentially in your views, where possibly where Miguel and Gabby are coming from is more gen pop and more broader, which that sounded very much like, and possibly where Jackson's views differ a little bit is the application to a physique competitor. So I don't know if Jackson wants to kind of jump in with your thoughts there.
Yeah. So I wouldn't dispute any of the benefits that Gabby and Miguel are discussing that are associated with intuitive eating, reducing eating disorder symptoms, improving relationships with food, building awareness with hunger and satiety cues. But given that this is a fitness podcast, and I assume the demographic have some sort of goal or objective that can't be achieved with them being weight neutral, I think we probably need to discuss it a little bit more in the context of athletes. And I do feel as though athletes, but some other people, might be using or overusing intuitive eating without realizing it isn't very conducive to their goals that can't be achieved while remaining weight neutral in the long run, such as gaining muscle mass, reducing body fat, or both. And I think part of this comes down to members of the fitness industry not understanding the principles and expected outcomes of intuitive eating. Like, they might understand the body image and eating psychology benefits, but not understand that this behavior is typically associated with weight stability and not a tool for performance, weight, or body composition change. I think most intuitive eating users in the fitness industry understand that the premise is built upon eating to biological cues. But I think some who don't fully understand the concept are forgetting that it is against our biological interests to carry absurd amounts of muscle mass that will slow us down and make us susceptible to predators, nor is it to be abnormally lean where we wouldn't outlast a famine. So if either of those physique outcomes are the goal, biological navigation isn't likely to get us there. Some overriding of biological cues is going to be required. Now, obviously, this recommendation is very contextual on what your goals are. The further to one end of the spectrum and the more extravagant your goals are, i.e. you don't want to just look like a normal guy or girl on the beach. You want people to go, oh, fuck, he's jacked, or, whoa, she's shredded. And they're perfectly reasonable goals to have. But in that case, intuitive eating is probably going to be less viable to you. Now, that doesn't mean advocating going complete robot mode and turning off intuition completely. An athlete can still use these characteristics of mindfulness within practicing flexible dietary restraint. For example, paying attention to internal cues when you're getting really damn freaking hungry at night. So then you shorten your eating window and push a bunch of your allocated calories back later in the day, or paying attention to internal cues where performance in the gym is really suffering. So you then move a greater proportion of your carbohydrate allowance around the training window or something like that. But that's not a completely intuitive approach. That's using principles of intuitive eating, but within the context of some sort of dietary restraint.
Excellent. I think, Gabby, you had some thoughts on kind of where Jackson was going with that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because this is really exactly why we stress that intuitive eating is not a dieting tool. It's not something that should be applied for weight modification, that any weight change that occurs as a result of pursuing the intuitive eating principles would just be a side effect of improving one's relationship with food and relationship with themselves. So if an individual is perhaps in a cycle of yo-yo dieting or emotional eating, they can then break that cycle and focus on their mental health and meet those needs in other ways. So absolutely, this is not something that's meant to be applied for physique outcomes or for performance outcomes. However, given the prevalence of eating disorders and disordered eating in the athletic population, I think that we're sort of missing almost the point of the application of something like intuitive eating or even mindful eating, is that we're there to enhance and improve an individual's relationship with food. And that can quite often be broken in individuals who are sort of chronically ignoring their hunger and satiety signals and are responding only to external cues to drive their eating behaviors. And so we really do tend to focus quite a lot on external factors, controlling our food environment, controlling our social situations, so we can sort of create a safe space for ourselves that doesn't contain any sort of tempting foods, that we reduce the palatability of our food so that we're not driven to eat more. And perhaps we ignore some of the internal work that could be done to bolster that framework so that when we are in a tempting food environment, we have better recognition of the fact that, okay, we're very food suggestible. So maybe we want to eat just because food is present. And if we remain mindful of that, we choose not to. That's just one example. But Dean from Flex Success brought up some really good points, that in individuals who never practice these skills, who don't really get a chance to practice attunement with biological signals, who don't take the time to examine why they might want to eat for emotional reasons, who function really well with a set of strict dietary rules on a cut in comp prep, that when those rules are removed after comp prep, what do I do then? I don't have the external rules to dictate what I eat when. How do I know when to start eating? How do I know when to stop eating? What do I do when I'm feeling really stressed and emotional and I want to start eating? How do I meet my needs in another way? So that's what this is about. It's about repairing the relationship with food, not something that's used for dieting or physique enhancement. And perhaps once that relationship is either repaired or built for the first time, perhaps, then down the line, a person will perhaps have an easier time dieting. And then after a restrictive dieting phase, maybe they won't have a significant rebound. Maybe they will then be better protected against the development of disordered eating. Because really one of the strongest predictors of developing an eating disorder is dieting behavior. And so that could be one of, what they sort of in the meta that Miguel brought up, they're talking about unhealthy weight management behaviors, things like fasting, binge purge cycles, or, various behaviors that I think some people would say are maybe on the lower end of the disordered eating spectrum. If we're talking about restricting calories very low. So of course, those are all things that you might have to do as a physique athlete. You will need absolutely to have a significant caloric restriction in order to reach very low levels of body weight. But we do really need to recognize that those things can precipitate disordered eating and eating disorders. And I think that it's in our best interest and our clients' best interests that we keep that in mind and that we remain open to processes that will allow us to work on the internal environment so that the external environment doesn't matter quite as much. I think that would really be beneficial if individuals were well equipped to handle tempting food environments and to handle social pressures and to handle stress so that even in the face of, really restrictive dietary practices for comp prep, that they don't then develop an eating disorder or disordered eating.
Fantastic. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So really, really great stuff from everybody. Gabby. So we're not supposed to use intuitive eating to enhance the dieting process. But does that mean that once we use intuitive eating on people, they are retired from physique sport? Because if we use it, let's say you realize, okay, my eating psychology is not amazing. I still want to be in physique sport later. I want to be in it after this next off season. Can't I use intuitive eating principles both now to heal my psychology a bit in a very large sense, and then use elements of them, especially mindful eating, later in prep? Because you're being very clear about the fact that intuitive eating is not supposed to be a tool. But if it's not a tool, then it should have no place in discussions of physique athlete diets outside of once you're retired and real fucked up in the head, time to fix yourself and never diet again.
Well, would you want to wait until someone's retired to fix them? Or would you potentially want to, and this is a personal decision, but if your relationship with food is so invasive that it is reducing your quality of life and reducing your relationships with those around you, at that point, I think you have to make a decision about what you're going to prioritize, your current physique or your long-term mental and potentially physical health. That, I think, is the question for the individual to answer themselves. Can a person potentially utilize the principles of intuitive eating and then later perform physique or compete in physique sports? I don't know of any rules that say any, in either direction. And really one of the central tenets of intuitive eating is that, there are no rules. And so I'm not going to say yes or no to that. That's a person's decision. But there are many practitioners, and I think this also comes down to having worked with clients who want to pursue intuitive eating and also lose weight. And this is something that I've seen in quite a few of my telehealth clients, that it's incredibly difficult. It's like spinning the wheels on a bicycle in two different directions. And Evelyn Tribole spoke about this as well on her recent podcast with Dan Harris, that she initially, was trying to work with folks who wanted to do both at the same time. And they are just not conducive. They're completely incongruent because it is very difficult to practice unconditional positive self-regard and self-acceptance while still desiring a smaller body, because quite often the reason that we desire a smaller body is not coming from a really positive place. It's not coming from a place of self-acceptance and appreciation and self-respect. Not to say that it can't, but it just doesn't quite often in individuals who have sort of a broken relationship with food.
Yeah.
But the principles of mindful eating as a skill set, I think could be readily applied in a number of different situations, because that is really increasing attunement with biological hunger and satiety signals. And while those may not be useful, if we are eating in response to biological hunger and then stopping when we are satiated, that might result in weight stability. It could result in weight loss or weight gain. That is really kind of beside the point. But I think increasing that attunement would allow individuals to then move into a more natural eating pattern after a physique comp prep, when they have just been, for several months ignoring hunger and satiety signals and perhaps eating specific amounts on a specific schedule. If we want to look for something that I think is a little bit more sustainable and realistic long-term, it would be something like that, or informed eating, which was developed by Flex Success or sort of conceptualized by Flex Success, is really applying the principle of gentle nutrition, which is one of the central principles of intuitive eating, where we do have some nutritional IQ and that we are paying attention to the types of foods that we're eating. Because no, intuitive eating is not, even though we have an unconditional permission to eat, any food fits, that we realize that quite often, if we are only eating the most hyperpalatable foods and we're eating past the point of fullness and we're eating to the point where we're uncomfortable, that really is against the paradigm of intuitive eating as well, because that's not going to make us feel good in the long run, mentally, physically, or emotionally. So can we, put these in, between potential phases of focus more on performance and things like that? I would say probably yes. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people that would say absolutely not. But, because this is so new, and because I think the goal here is to bridge the gap and illustrate places where this can benefit physique competitors, I would say you probably would, if a person wants to pursue this at any stage because they've realized that their relationship with food is damaged and that they want to improve it for whatever purpose, I would say, yeah, absolutely, utilize it.
Yeah. I think it's important to point out that a physique athlete would use the more extreme intuitive eating approach as part of a diet break, so to speak, and they would know that. So I think the folks you're talking about, the clients you're talking about, a lot of times, and I've had similar experiences, where they want to still lose weight right now, and also use intuitive eating right now. Like, hey, can you teach me how to use intuitive eating now so I can lose weight tomorrow? That for sure doesn't work. It's like trying to work really hard at your vacation, which is a contradiction in terms. So I do absolutely think there's a timing element to this, but I also seem to think that there's probably ways to apply intuitive eating cycles and even take mindful and informed eating out of sort of those threads and apply them always to dieting, so that you never do go quite as crazy again. Or potentially, if you do go that crazy, it's at a justifiably lean body fat where it's worth the crazy. So to me, I seem to be bumping it as well with Miguel's comments into this thing where, weight stigma can be a really bad thing. And the process of measuring your body weight can very quickly result into, this is the number that matters, do whatever it takes to get there, you fat piece of shit. And until you're not fat, you're still a piece of shit, possibly always, right? And this is all these bad things. And intuitive eating, says diet culture is really, really bad. Tending to your food and a non-intuitive thing is really, really bad. But I think maybe the reality is somewhere in between, where, we can, intuitive eating can be used in the context of dieting for enhancement of body composition, and that can potentially result in a very good thing of making you as lean as you want with much less long-term psychological cost or just more wisdom in navigating. And also on the issue of dealing with obese populations and interventional approaches where you say, okay, either we're going to teach you how to eat healthy or tell you to focus on healthy eating. versus focus on your body weight, I think maybe we can treat body weight a little bit more like we treat like an HDL or LDL cholesterol score. Like, hey, like, nobody says, listen, your LDL is too high. Get out in the world, keep monitoring it, do whatever the fuck it takes to get it down. They're like, okay, what does that mean? Broccoli all the time, and then do broccoli poisoning or something. So maybe it's like, hey, listen, like, you're over fat. That's the problem. And your weight is an indicator of that. But we're not going to like perseverate on your weight. We're going to teach you how to eat healthy, because eating healthy is what brings your weight down, right? It's not like bringing your weight down is just a metric. It's not an action. You don't bring your weight down. You do things to bring your weight down. You got to teach people what to do. So it's kind of like these, in the many of the studies, the two groups. One group's like, hey, here's all these great ways to eat that will do all the great things we want, including bringing your weight down. And this other group's like, you're too fat. Fuck off and come back less fat. Like, yeah, they didn't even get any tools. So maybe we can say, hey, we're not going to tell you to lose weight. We're going to tell you how to eat healthy and do all these great things. When you come in for your checkup 2, 3, 4, whatever months later, we're going to look at your body weight as just one of the many metrics of your health, a very important one, of course, and say, hey, listen, your HDL is getting better. Your body weight's still pretty close to where it was, which is totally fine. But hey, keep plugging away the diet. Maybe we can do some things like eat more vegetables, eat more lean meats, stay away from junk food that reduce calories more, because we know that will bring down the body weight, which is fundamentally a good thing. So maybe we don't throw out the body weight completely. We just put it in its place of not as stigmatized and not as cancerous of a sociological element, sort of put it back in its rightful place. I don't think kicking it to the curb completely is maybe the best idea. Among one of the many reasons I can think that is in hyper-obese patients, for example, there's no amount of returning back to really good healthy eating principles that's going to reduce your risk factors from hyperobesity by a really significant enough margin, especially to qualify you for bariatric surgery, for example. Very low calorie, purposefully calorically reduced diets with body weight as the critical monitoring variable are essential in saving lives in this field of work. So for someone that's 300, 350 pounds, if you get them to get in touch with their eating habits and eat very well again, they might trend from 350 to 300 or even 275. They might have it within them, though, to trend all the way to, eventually get down to 200, 225, which would be way better for their health. But that might take some concerted, willful, purposeful efforts to reduce calories, increase expenditure to the point where it is not psychologically sustainable. It is not meant to be sustainable. There are various things you do in your life which are not meant to be sustainable. Going to work's not sustainable. You don't stay at work for the rest of your life. You go home and go to sleep, hypothetically, interact with other humans. So at the end of the day, maybe if we take a sort of more holistic approach, we can say, hey, listen, fundamentally intuitive eating and good treating your body with respect is a great baseline approach for everyone. And then on top of that, some folks might need to, push the gears a little bit and lose some weight, purposefully have some goals where we push the hypocaloric condition a bit extremely for several months on end. This includes physique athletes, of course, who are doing it for their purposes, and people who are, pretty well over fat and whose settling point won't allow them just with healthy intuitive eating to get down to where they should be for their best outcomes. Because it's great, and many of the studies, as Miguel outlined, do show that people can go from 300 to 275 with intuitive eating. They usually don't trend much lower than that. And they have to go lower than that if they're going to get the best effects. That takes work. That takes confronting the fact that, you're not ready to enter a state of what I would call balance. You're not woosah just yet. You have to grind a little bit more for balance. Now, that's grinding like going to work. You go to work for a few days, then you take some days of vacation. You go to work for a few days, then days of vacation. Just the same way you would approach dieting. Your body weight doesn't have to be the focus, but it is an important metric. And there are times to push and there are times to back off. I don't think we can throw that tool away and say, like, for example, people who are 600 pounds who show up for medical surgery, be like, we're not going to put you on a 1,200 calorie diet. We're just going to tell you to eat a little better. And then, 3 months later, they're dead. But they were feeling pretty great, versus if they get put on a very low calorie diet, they lose enough weight to be candidates for surgery, so on and so forth. That's an extreme example. I think we have so many folks in the United States and the Western world, especially Australia. The Australians are really fat, and they're just miserable people in general. So, JK. So, but when you got people weighing 200, 300, 400 pounds regularly, I think intuitive eating and all these approaches psychologically are really beneficial as a baseline. But then some folks need to be very gently, very holistically, very compassionately helped to get lower in body weight. I would actually say help to reduce their level of adiposity, of which body weight is a very good, but not exclusive measure, not to be stigmatized, but to be used intelligently. And I think you guys might agree with me, Jackson and I, and some of the health at every size people, maybe not all of them, but certainly the most vocal ones, have said, look, body weight is this sort of sociological cancer. And of course, fueled by capitalism, as all bad things are. It's the problem. And it's like, the body weight's not the problem. It's just a lot of people have attached themselves to it. If we can teach folks to detach to some extent from it, but use it as a cool metric that's just part of the picture, maybe we can have sort of all of our cake and eat it too. That was a nasty pun, nasty little analogy there at the end. It was really just abusive. So I'll just shut up now.
I know, Jackson, you put up your hand a while ago. I don't know if you've got something to add in there.
Yeah, it was just when Gabby was mentioning that, like sort of in the context of physique athletes or physique sports, it comes down to what you prioritize. I think most athletes are aware that peak performance or physique development often requires some trade-offs. So for example, risk of scores increasing on an eating disorders exam or scores for cognitive restraint in an athlete dropping weight for a contest is not much different to the risk of head trauma for an NFL athlete. Like, sure, we should and we can minimize some of the risks by putting tackling rules in place and modifying helmets, but complete avoidance of head contact just can't be avoided as long as they want to lace up and play the game. Now, an example trade-off in physique sports is this temporary grinding in a state of low energy availability to reduce the body fat before contest. Sure, most of us are aware and understand the health implications of chronic low energy availability or relative energy deficiency syndrome, but does that mean we should advise a higher energy availability diet for the athlete? Well, we can, but it sure as hell won't get them in shape on show day. Low energy availability to reach bodybuilding condition is a necessary beast. I think in the same way, some form of dietary restraint is probably going to be needed to optimize physique or performance. And this might be a sort of a controversial theme, and I hope it isn't interpreted as me only caring about the physical outcomes, because I just ran a 60-person diet study and half of the outcomes were physiological measures. But if you're a coach and you're working with an athlete or someone who has come to you to help them reach a competitive or physique goal, I think you need to place the physiological outcomes or physical outcomes slightly above the psychological, or at least of equal importance. Because when working with an athlete or competitor, you got to do what's needed to get them there, get them ready, get them performing, but with the least psychological disturbance that you can. So even though eating restraint and calorie counting is associated with these worse eating disorder symptoms, abolishing the risk of psychological disturbance is going to be lower on the ladder of priority compared to reaching the sport or the physique outcome itself, which after all is a reason that they came to you in the first place, or the reason you're an athlete trying to get on the bodybuilding stage. Because if an athlete comes to you and they say, well, I'd like to be sub 10% for my contest in 10 weeks, you can't say to them, okay, we're going to adopt a weight neutral approach to eating so you don't develop any eating disorder symptoms, and so you have fantastic eating psychology. Because I'll be like, so I'm going to be under 10% by my contest, yeah? And you'll be like, well, probably not. And the athlete's going to be like, well, okay, I'm probably going to need my money back.
Awesome. I think something just to try and kind of work to a kind of practical application, at least for the audience that we have, and it's something me and Miguel spoke about when I had Miguel on to talk about kind of intuitive and mindful eating, was that there can be planned periods away from contest. And I know Renaissance periodization, yourself, Mike, you have kind of maintenance periods built in within dieting phases, so that after a diet, kind of you have a prolonged maintenance period. Even in an off-season kind of gaining phase, you might have these lower volume training periods. And me and Miguel were kind of saying how potentially at those times, that's when practices of intuitive eating, and maybe fully going intuitive eating because you don't have a weight goal outcome at that time, can be really kind of applicable. So yeah, I wonder, Gabby, is that kind of something that you see as applicable to kind of a physique athlete?
Yeah, I think the only difference that I would say, because I'm in agreement with Jackson, would be that and this could be approaching a coaching approach as well, that I really emphasize client-led approaches. And so if a client were to say, this is not sustainable for me, my psychology is suffering from this, and I don't want to continue this this comp prep. I think it's probably their decision as to what is prioritized, their physical outcome or their psychological outcome. But other than that, yeah, absolutely. As I said, intuitive eating is not a tool to be used for weight modification. It is a process that allows us to improve our relationships with food, and potentially, it might be something, at least having an understanding of these principles and being able to recognize perhaps some of the red flags or risk factors for a person being very close to developing an eating disorder, that we might be able to then say, okay, maybe this isn't the best time for a person to pursue a comp prep diet, or, have that discussion with them. But I think it was sort of the maybe some of the misunderstandings and some of the fear and some of the skepticism about these movements really came about from having an incomplete picture of what they actually are. And one of the things that Mike brought up, when we're looking at, weight focused outcomes versus weight neutral outcomes, and where individuals end up landing when they're losing weight. The meta that Miguel brought up, both groups lost very, very small amount of weight after about 6 to 9 months. It was about 3% of their body weight was all that they was what they had sustained a total loss of. And the weight focus group lost about I think it was 2.7% more, sustained over a long period of time. So while absolutely weight loss can be beneficial, and all of the behaviors that Mike listed are awesome behaviors that we want to encourage, we still have to look at why individuals are engaging in those behaviors or not. And that's really where we're getting to the psychological side of things, and why we have to focus so much on the internal. Things like looking at the drivers for pursuing weight loss. We see better adherence in individuals who are pursuing weight loss for health reasons versus those who are pursuing weight loss for aesthetic reasons. So the focus on the focus on health, I think, really is something that can be applicable across the board, whether we're looking at physique athletes or sport athletes or gen pop. That obviously an athlete is not going to be able to compete at their best long term if we're not promoting their health, and of all health, mental, physical, and emotional.
So this was the first episode of 2 of the Intuitive Eating Roundtable. Next week, 1 p.m. UK time, as always, part number 2 will be live. Also, make sure to hit the subscribe button below, hit the notification button as well, so that you're always notified when a new episode goes live. Other than that, leave a comment in the comment section below, and thank you very much for always tuning in and supporting us, and I guess I'll see you next week.
So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Flor. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people. But each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics. Discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
the exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy. We're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge, and I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.